Like their masters, the ships of the Chaos Fleet were once loyal to the Emperor of Mankind, but the corrupting influence of the Dark Gods had warped them to something fouler and more dangerous. Now, imbued with hellish energy, they come to take revenge on an Imperium that they once served. And now I will help teach you everything you need to know to make the galaxy burn. Hello there everyone. It is time to talk over the second of the two introductory fleets in Battlefleet Gothic Armada 2, or at least what is deemed as the simplest to get into, and those are going to be the Chaos Forces. And right off the bat, their playstyle is going to vary greatly from the Imperial Navy, mainly due to the fact that the Imperial Navy rely on a much more aggressive in-your-face type of mentality with their heavy prow armor, their torpedoes, and just the sheer power of their weapons in close. Chaos, on the other hand, emphasize a lot more on longer range type of harassment, their higher mobility, and kind of playing a much more tactical type of game. For almost half of their fleet, well over half their fleet is equipped with a lance battery of some sort, and when you consider the fact these lances always hit, it encourages that long range type of mentality. They also have a plethora of bombers and fighter bays available to them, but primarily almost everything shoots at exclusively over 9,000 feet range, with a few exceptions in the Slaughter and the Retaliator. Everything else is basically equipped to shoot as far a range as possible. And when you combo this with the fact that the Chaos Fleet has higher speed in comparison to the Imperial Navy, which I would dub as kind of the average speed in general, the 160 unit speed, they can get a lot more mobile and they can keep their distance a lot better. When you combo this with the fact that they have the same kind of plasma reactor as the Imperial Navy, they have the potential to be the fastest fleet in the game for chasing ships down or at least running away. And hell, they even have access to the fastest cruiser in the entire game, just hands down, the Slaughter, which is the one unique ship that has the short range, as I already hinted at, and it also has the speed upgrade to help justify this in this regard. Otherwise, they have multiple carriers for every type of tier in the Hellbringer Mark II for the light cruisers, Devastation for the cruiser class, the Stig for the battle cruiser, Retaliator, as we already mentioned, for the Grand Cruiser, and the Spoiler for the battleship. Every single one of these categories has launch bays available to you. Otherwise, their stats all around is pretty generic, pretty similar to what you see in the Imperial Navy, in that they have no modifier to their bravery, they have average troop efficiency, and they have the same kind of raw hit points that the Imperial Navy has. With the one major factor that differs from them, as I already hinted at, they don't have the substantially heavier armor on the front, and they have the same type of rotation speed as their Imperial Navy counterparts. They also only have 3 ships in the entire fleet that has access to torpedoes of any kind, one of which is their escort ship, the Infidel, and the Desolator and the Repulsive are the only other 2 cruisers and battleships that have access to torpedoes, so burst damage is pretty restricted unless you are able to get the most out of your bombers and fighter bays. Now, when I talk about a tactical game, I'm referring to the fact that you need to rely a lot on your positioning and awareness of the map itself, as fighting on the terms of your enemy is sure to result in your defeat there ultimately. If you have to fight a close range engagement against Orcs or the Imperial Navy, you are almost certainly going to lose that match just due to the fact that you have less durability all around with your lack of prow armor. As to how you deploy your fleet, even at the very beginning of the match, can heavily impact the effectiveness of your fleet for the majority of this battle. For if you leave yourself pitched along the corner of the map, trying to hug along it, you're going to find yourself with very little room to maneuver if your opponent is very tenacious or has a very aggressive playstyle. You're going to get wedged into a corner more often than not, then you're going to have to be forced to fight closer range. And while you may be equipped to do well in close range with arm-piercing rounds and heavy macro cannons, you are not designed in general to be that kind of fleet. Your higher speed and your longer range weaponry encourages you to try and cripple and whittle down your opponent in a fight, while taking objectives and gaining the tactical advantage with your mobility. Ideally, you want to grab the center of the map as quickly as possible with your higher speed, especially if you're equipped with things like emission dissipator or having a lot of light cruisers and frigates for your spotting and forward awareness. And then it gives you a little more freedom there to kind of position yourself. make use of gas clouds or even asteroid belts when necessary if you are worried about long-range engagements or even like bombers and seeker missiles or any kind of like tracking torpedoes that may be coming your way. You can use those to conceal yourself, immediately negating the value those missiles have against you. And against fighters and bombers, it's a great way to kind of get them off your heels. But with that said, even though fighters can keep you visible even with the gas cloud and asteroid belts, the sheer speed of the Chaos Fleet greatly hinders or limits the effectiveness of these fighters and bombers. For straight off the bat, almost all your cruisers and even your Desolator battleship is able to outrun the fighters almost completely. So you don't have to worry about losing your point defense for the longer term engagements when the assault ships and the bombers themselves start to come on in. And ideally, if you could stall the game long enough, any carrier type fleet will easily run out of steam, for they will have no fighters to kind of distract your point defense, and you will have a very easy time shooting down bombers, the assault ships, or even any boarding torpedoes or seeker missiles that the fleets may be equipped with. You could play a long range engagement just by whittling down their valuable resources. The speed is also amazing for dodging Nova cannons and even bombs in general. Whereas Imperial Navy would have a little more difficult time if aimed properly, Chaos more often than not can just sprint on through, and this is even more so with your slaughters if you can use them in daring maneuvers to kind of bait out these type of weapons. Your movement is key, and ultimately how you're going to get the most out of the speeds to try and take control of the map itself. You want to put your opponent in a precarious position where they may be forced to spread out their fleet, and then if you're equipped with enough light cruisers or frigates, or even daring enough to go in with slaughters in your cruisers, then you can dive bomb them and try and whittle them down. For your boarding can still be pretty impactful for crippling, if not disabling, light cruisers and most cruisers if you do it properly. And with their heavily lack of firepower from a disorganized or displaced fleet, you are free to get in close and do the damage that's necessary. You do have to be very careful of ramming attempts though, since the majority of your weapons are equipped on the broadside, much like the Imperial Navy, so you don't have the convenience of absorbing damage as well. Whereas the Imperial Navy have the torpedoes that kind of encourage you to just face your prow to and try to do the ramming maneuvers. In the case of Chaos, more often than not, you're going to be doing more damage to yourself. Even with like the case of the Desolator or the Repulsive, that do have torpedoes, but with the lack of armor, the morale damage is going to be a lot more significant, and the damage to yourself is also going to be felt if you're not hitting something that's a lot smaller than those ships. Baiting out opportunities and aggressive plays can also be advantageous for you as well, for if your opponent uses their combustion gauge to try and close with your flagship, or which may in a lot of cases be your battleship, you have access to micro warp jump and other abilities to kind of keep your distance and just have the advantage of your combustion gauge not being used as opposed to your opponent, which may be burnt out or spent, depending on how much they invested in trying to get close to your flagship, or even your cruisers in general. A well-placed stasis bomb will allow you to get those distance even if they're only brief, and allow you to keep hammering down your opponent. But ideally you want to play the map. And then once your opponent decides to abandon the objective altogether and go super aggressive on you, you are kind of free to do hard disengage, since it's almost impossible for a fleet to catch you. Even the Eldari fleets are going to have a lot of difficulty keeping range on you with their 9,000 range to their weaponry. So if you do a hard disengage and just boost on out, you can easily avoid their fleet while having your frigates, light cruisers, and anything else that's placed around the map to just steal points behind them. A lot of the times you're going to not really be winning by destroying their fleet more often than not. The majority of your fleet, the majority of your cruisers and battleships are more to kind of like be the distraction, to be the bait. And then ideally you want to make your play on the opponent fleet and get aggressive when they start separating them, and you have the means to kind of reposition yourself in a way that you can focus that ship down. For since you are fighting at such a long range, it can be very easy for your opponent to kind of protect the ships you are trying to focus down. Even with critical hits on the engines or generators, if a ship is in the way, then you're not going to be doing damage to them, unless somehow you got a complete surround on the fleet, which can be amazing to constantly be hammering the one crippled ship. It does make it really difficult at the same time to hit this ship that you want with everything you got. If you set your engagement distance to the maximum range possible, this can help a whole lot in keeping your fleet circling around the opponent without you having to micromanage it so much. 4. You can get overwhelmed a lot of the time if you're just frantically boosting and trying to run with multiple fleets at the same time, especially when you have them spread out. So with lock-on enabled and set to the maximum engagement that you can get, which is 22,500 units, this makes it a lot more easier for you to just have a lot more simpler control with this fleet. Chaos is also one of the only factions that has a massive plethora of abilities and upgrades available to them. A lot of this is because some of their sub-factions also unlocks additional abilities and upgrades for you to utilize. For if you pick the Death Guard, the Emperor's Children, the Thousand Sons, or even the World Eaters, they all unlock an additional upgrade that you get when you reach Admiral level 10 for the fleet. So for the Death Guard, you get access to avoid Locust Swarm Cloud for in-close damage potential while repairing your fleet, and this is good on top of the new patch that was recently implemented that allows you to adjust your skills and upgrades while you're at the deployment phase of a battle. This allows you to complement a close range type of engagement for when it's warranted. Emperor's Children for Slaanesh's Promise allows you to lock down ships and even deactivate their shields and holofields for a brief period of time. Mind you, this is only a 5-second window, but this is great for allowing you to maximize your damage briefly if you can combine it with a hold fire on a very slippery type of Eldar fleet, or you can use this to just get a little bit extra distance if you have a stasis bomb already spent or not available for you. The Thousand Sons get the Winded Change, and this is an incredibly potent ability if used properly, for it allows it to be a mobile gas cloud, and when the only means of being detected is within 4,500 range of an actual ship or being revealed by a scanner pulse, this becomes almost essential in the later term games. If you are able to snipe down the enemy frigates and evade any beacons from sticking onto your fleet, you are almost untouchable if the fleet cannot even get close to you. And if you can avoid the 9,000 units identification range in general, it is almost impossible for your fleet to get touched. And the World Eaters are the other faction that encourages an in-close type of aggression, for they get the Bloodletter parties, which allows them to do a lot of boarding potential to a ship. This can be incredibly impactful regardless of the ship, whether you're going for an all-cruiser type fleet, even light cruisers, although that can be a very difficult fleet to utilize with the Assault Run, and due to the lack of firepower available to the light cruisers, this allows you to cripple down ships bit by bit. So there are very many type of play styles that you can take advantage of. Alas, you will have to pick the sub-faction before you know what faction you're going up against. So, understanding of what your fleet's capable of and where it's strongest is key for the options that you have available to you. If you are wanting to try and keep your distance at all times with like a land-based fleet or just maximum range macro cans, the Thousand Sons is probably the way you want to go. Unless you're feeling more daring and want to be more aggressive, you could perhaps go with the Emperor's Children for the Slaanesh benefits, and to have access to siren cans, which can be useful for crippling down the morale of a ship over time. Although, the Chaos Fleet can be one of the harder type of fleets to get full value out of, since due to the fact they have a really difficult time to burst down a target really quickly. If you do go with a close range type of macro can type build with the Slaughters or the Carnages, you are going to be lacking those torpedoes, which is kind of essential to really get the killing blow on something. You have to rely heavily on your opponent not being able to counterattack there and your own ability to dodge ramming attempts. That is going to be key a lot of the times, is taking full advantage of mobility to kind of avoid taking direct fire as much as possible while whittling down your victim. And while bombers can essentially be good damage over time, they are heavily restricted by the fact that most players can deal with these relatively well, especially if they have any dedicated carrier ships of their own, so you will find you'll run out of steam with these type of fleets, and they won't have the firepower to back it up on their own. You need to get full value of your bombers and your assault ships if you want to win the day with that, which ultimately means you need to isolate the ships if you want your bombers to do the most damage possible and have a very real chance of returning to do consecutive runs. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the fleets that I've been utilizing for Battlefleet Gothic Armada 2, and I had two variants that I've been jumping back and forth between. I have the Lance variant in a Desolator, 3 Acherons, and 6 Infidel Raiders. And this may seem like a very odd type of fleet considering the fact that since I have so many frigates and I have a battleship, I could easily equip myself with 5 Acrons if I so wished. The main problem you will find as you play with Chaos a lot of the times is your cruisers and even like your light cruisers are prone to getting their engines critically hit at inopportune times. The battleship is kind of served to be like the bulky tank of the fleet, trying to absorb the majority of the fire, and when you combine it with like abilities that can lock down ships to keep your distance like stasis bombs or a micro warp jump, it has the means to get out safely. It's also very important to note that the resilience of the battleship is quite greater than that of all the other ship classes. As it was noted in the very first patch update in Battlefleet Gothic Armada 2, the battleships technically take a fifth of the critical hit chance, or at least it reduces it down to a fifth, which makes it a lot more easier to avoid those troublesome type of engine critical hits that can screw you over on such a cutting mentality, comboed with the fact that if the engines do get critically hit, you do have the potential of a micro warp jump to at least get the ship out easily enough, at least until the repairs can come back up and you can go back to full speed. But ideally, at the start of the map, I want, with the combination of a mission dissipator the majority of the time, I like to go full on aggressively into the middle of the map and take as many points as possible. Hell, I might even go so far as to try and take a 4th point if I feel like I can win the frigate battle, since that's the one huge benefit of having so many frigates that even with very little effort in just ramming the opposing frigates, you can kind of come out on top and blind your opponent at the same time if you encounter all the frigates or they kind of cut back on those for their fission purposes. If you have to only deal with 2 frigates and you encounter them really early on, then you are setting yourself really well, especially in combination with the siege cloud effect that I mentioned earlier. Otherwise, once my main cruisers in the battleship grab their first point, I like to try and turn their side towards the middle of the map, or at least towards where the biggest conglomerate of the fleet is currently at, as I plan to engage them once they get towards the middle of the map themselves, in which case I unload a huge broadside of lances on them constantly and consistently, making note of any debris or gas clouds they may use to conceal themselves, in which case the sheer amount of frigates does help to keep vision on them. And while, as I hinted already, the firepower is a little bit lacking as opposed to 5 Acrons, I do still have the sheer hit point pool of the battleship itself, combined with the torpedoes to occasionally allow for aggressive dive bomb runs where I can fire torpedoes and even ram if the ship is crippled enough to justify such a maneuver, while at the same time eliminating a valuable target or a valuable component to your opponent's fleet. For once they start losing ships or once they get disorganized, this works a lot more better for you. For then slowly but surely, as you cripple their weapons, cripple their engines, or any component that's prevalent at the time, then you are free to be a little more aggressive and a little more in their face. Maybe not so much with this Lance fleet though. They always hit all the time, so you kind of want to stay at the max range possible. And what ultimately this does for you is as you circle around the fleet, your cruisers and your battleships themselves can capture points without you having to rely on your frigates to do that for you. So they can stay near the flank of the ship there while holding fire is an important factor so you don't give away that they're there more often than not. And then just continue to reveal when they conceal themselves with gas clouds or asteroid belts, or if that doesn't seem like it's a problem, then you could just have them steal points that they're flying away from, again forcing them to spread out their fleet. Now for my other fleet, I'll quickly go over the macro cannon type fleet. Is a lot more aggressive. It at least is more minded towards being aggressive, while still having the potential to do damage at long range. You're just not going to be doing it as consistently or as effective due to the lower critical hit chance. And while the Despoiler is a bit of an oddball in this fleet, it serves the same purpose as the Desolator does in that it allows the rest of my fleet to hopefully not be susceptible to engine critical hits. If you position the Carnages properly and circle them around the map and ideally behind the Despoiler when the engagement begins, you can start chipping down the shields and start getting the critical hits you need, if not just soften them up for the opportunity when you can dive in aggressively. In the case of Adeptus Mechanicus or even the Tau Empire, you can be free to get in there aggressively for following the same kind of rules as I mentioned in my Imperial Navy video, where you want to wait till certain cooldowns are enacted so that way they don't use them to kind of blunt your aggression. But with equipment like armor piercing ammo and the means to reduce the fall off of your range with your demonic sight, you are able to still be effective at longer range. It's just not going to be as consistent. You train off that longer range firepower for the means to do damage in close. But it can be tricky to maximize the damage with all your ships if you want to try and focus down a fleet with the armor-piercing ammo, since you do need to gain 4,500 unit range. And the one main downside of a Chaos fleet with macro cannons is since their rate of fire is so much more faster than the Imperial Navy fleet, you kind of need to commit to your engagement for a longer period of time. Whereas the Imperial Navy, with their rate of fire being 12 seconds, they have that freedom to turn their prows for a torpedo assault run every now and then. Chaos don't have that convenience, unfortunately, but you will be circling around your fleets, which again can make it tricky to focus down a fleet if they are clumped up. So you need to be aware of where the enemy fleet is at all times, so you can position yourself properly and ideally keep out of vision of the weaponry of most of their ships. And then, as they commit to trying to turn their ships around quickly with high energy turn or even a false maneuver, sometimes you could just sprint on out and then just keep distance that way. Or hell, you could even dive bomb right through them, and since they used up a lot of their valuable resources to get themselves turned around, their combustion gauge won't allow them to catch up with you, and you can get back at range relatively quickly. Maybe not safely, but so long as you're careful about your placement, you can do this relatively well. Ideally, I emphasize again, you want to separate the fleet due to the fact that you don't have the heavy prow to kind of soak the damage if they do focus down one of your weakened vessels. So you need to minimize their accuracy, minimize the damage potential by keeping outside of optimum range. This fleet only has 2 frigates available to it, so it's a little bit trickier to win the map awareness game, but if they're clumped up together, you can at least, in most situations, win on one flank at least, and start capturing the most valuable type of points that are necessary for a close range type of fleet. Now we're going to talk about some of the key upgrades that you will want to seriously consider for your Chaos fleet, and most of them I've already explained, especially the unique ones that are available to the 4 Chaos God sub-factions. Outside of those 4 abilities though, you have access to the Stasis Bomb, which is great at keeping distance. The Micro Warp Jump is incredible for baiting your opponent out of position or in an awkward predicament, or you could just jump out once they spend a good amount of their mobility resources. You also have the Disruption Bomb, which can be pretty key at getting guaranteed damage, but since this is a more slower type base fleet, this is only really practical for if you're going to get in their face with a macro cannon type of fleet, so that way you can eliminate the shields quickly and maximize your damage potential in close. For you're going to run out of charges really quickly if you're relying on this for lances or even fighting at maximum distance. You aren't going to do enough damage to ultimately justify this. You also have the Augur Probe, which can be really useful at denying certain areas, especially against the Eldari, since Chaos is going to have a really difficult time against Eldari due to the fact that your ramming is not as dangerous as opposed to most other factions, and your any lance-based builds are going to be struggling quite a bit if you're not fighting at them at maximum range and engaging them almost at the start of the match. The Augur Probe allows you to deny a direct path to your fleet, and if they fly into it and you reveal them early on, then you get yourself an early momentum, and most lesser skilled players will find themselves panicking under the whittling fire. For the lances are still going to do damage, and they're still slowly going to chip them down and do damage, especially in the case of Drukhari, which don't even benefit from the hollow field, so the lances are going to do full damage to them. Augur Disruptor Bomb has a very niche type of use, but it relies heavily on you being able to consistently destroy frigates, for this allows their sensors to be completely gone, and they're only going to have access to the 4,500 unit range, or scanner detection range. So this can combo incredibly well with the Thousand Suns Gas Cloud ability, or at least any kind of concealment that you're utilizing. So that way you can get a lot more free damage in if your opponent is not able to get in close effectively. Demonic Ritual is also a niche type of ability in that this will be useful against boarding heavy types of fleets like the Space Marines and the Tyranids. If you are taking critical damage or a lot of critical troop damage, then you can use this to help replenish that fleet and give you a lot more longevity long term. It can be tricky to get value out of this since it does give you more troops the larger the ship is, so ideally your battleships or Grand Cruisers are what you want to use this on, so you need to use that as bait if you want to get the most out of this ability. And with 3 charges, you are going to eventually run out of steam too, so you gotta make sure you're doing the damage necessary before the boring damage starts kicking in. And otherwise, for critical upgrades that you should seriously consider, a Mission Dissipator affects every single ship in the fleet. For the majority of the other fleets, with the exception of the Tau Empire, this would only affect the light cruisers and frigates, but in the case of Chaos, you have access to it for everything, which complements you slowly chipping down your opponent and keeping yourself concealed to minimize a lot of this damage potential. So if you are able to be very stealthy and blind your opponent effectively enough, then you can get an amazing value from your concealment strategy. Demonic Sight is pretty important if you feel like you're going to be playing a longer range type of game with macro cans. For while it's not nearly as effective as the exceptional accuracy of the Eldari that have their fall off drop in by 15% for every 4,500 unit range, this is basically halfway there. Whereas the accuracy for Imperial Navy, Chaos, and all those with normal accuracy, it's 80% accuracy, 60, 40, and 20% for each of the increments of distance. And this just basically is how accurate, or the likeliness of your cannons actually hitting the target if it falls through on its current trajectory when it fires. But with its Demonic Sight, this would change the accuracy to 80, 60, 50, 40, 30% at extreme range. And that's not even including the additional accuracy you would get if you have lock-on available. Armor-piercing ammunition goes without saying, even though this is the updated version now where it's been nerfed to only reduce armor by 15. Against most fleets, you are still getting a substantial damage increase. If you ever have to face off against Space Marines and the Necrons, it's still almost double your damage at point blank range, so this is still valuable if you feel like you have to get in close engagements. But ideally, with the sheer amount of boarding potential and firepower they have in close, you do need to be smart when you're considering this type of upgrade. Also, even though I never really talked about the boarding very much, there is still a plethora of different boarding options available for a boarding based fleet. So I talked about the World Eaters and their boarding percentage and the Bloodletter parties. The Khorne Berserkers allows your broadside boarding to increase their critical hit chance. You got Chaos Space Marines that basically give an all-around type of assault action critical hit bonus. And then you have the Helldrake Forges, which allows your boarding actions from your assault ships to greatly increase their critical hit chance. So while the carrier ships may be greatly hindered in their firepower directly, if you can get successfully board the ships with a combination of your fighters as distraction or even hitting isolated ships, you can very quickly cripple them with the sheer stacking potential of these critical hits. And while this may be a niche upgrade, the Many-Eyed Prophet could be useful for frigates and anything else trying to spot at range if you don't want to resort to using your scanner pulses. Again, this is kind of a niche type upgrade that you really need to think on how you're going to get value out of it. For more often than not, the frigates can do the job on their own without having to rely on the silent detection, since that's the main benefit of this upgrade here. It will not reveal where your frigates are, so you can safely maneuver them into a better position either to steal points behind your opponent without them realizing it, or just to keep between the two fleets and maybe help shoot down some fighters and bombers when it's warranted. There is some hidden value here, but it is tricky to utilize. Now, I will admit the Chaos Fleet may be one of the harder type of fleets to get victory with, due to the fact that a lot of opponents want to try and kill their adversary quickly, and more often than not don't play the objective. But you still have means with the Slaughter and a lot of the Macrocan builds to still do a lot of damage in close. It will ultimately come down to your awareness and the means of maximizing your mobility that will get you victory if you're going to try for the aggressive type of play. So I hope you found this video helpful. I thank you everyone for watching, and I will see you on the battlefield.